What happens when the softest voice in pop music is also the one crying the loudest inside? She was the voice that soothed a generation, warm, gentle, unmistakable. Karen Carpenter sang of love, longing, and rainy days with such delicate sincerity that it felt like she was whispering directly to the soul. Her songs became part of the soundtrack to people's lives, playing quietly in the background of weddings, road trips, heartbreaks, and Sunday mornings. Yet behind that golden voice was a woman, slowly fading, both in body and spirit. Karen wasn't just a singer, she was the voice, the kind you never forget once you hear it. A contralto rare in pop music, tender but commanding, effortless yet aching. Alongside her brother Richard, she rose to stardom as one half of the Carpenters, a duo that would go on to sell over 90 million records worldwide. But even at the height of her fame, something was unraveling beneath the surface. Her decline didn't come in dramatic headlines or scandalous rumors. It came silently, in skipped meals, in pills hidden in bathroom cabinets, in long hours asleep behind closed doors. And by the time the world realized what was happening, it was already too late. On February 4th, 1983, just one day after having breakfast and laughing with her family, Karen collapsed in the closet of her parents' home. She was only 32 years old. The official cause, heart failure due to years of damage from anorexia nervosa, an illness few even understood at the time. How does someone so cherished, so deeply needed by the world, feel so invisible in her own life? This is not just the story of a singer, it's the story of a girl who sang her heart out, but no one truly listened to what it was saying. A story of beauty and pain, of perfection and pressure, of applause that couldn't drown out the silence inside. Before we begin, take a breath and listen, not just to her voice, but to what it tried to tell us all along. Karen Ann Carpenter was born on March 2nd, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut. A quiet child with large brown eyes and a soft voice that barely rose above a whisper. Her family soon relocated to Downey, California, where suburban streets and sunny afternoons painted the backdrop of her formative years. But inside the Carpenter household, the air was rarely easy. The attention was always drawn to her older brother Richard, the musical prodigy, the golden child. Karen, by contrast, was seen as the chubby little sister, sweet but secondary. It was a label she would carry for the rest of her life. Music, however, was always in the air. Richard practiced the piano obsessively while Karen gravitated toward rhythm. At Downey High, she picked up the drums, not singing, not yet. It was behind the drum kit where she first felt strong, in control. "Drummers are the backbone," she once said. And for a time, she was content to stay in the background, letting others take the spotlight. But her voice, so rich, so unusually low for a female pop singer, couldn't be hidden for long. A recording session with Richard in the late 60s revealed her gift almost by accident. Once people heard that voice, earthy, melancholic, and utterly disarming, it became clear that Karen wasn't meant to stay behind the drums. Together, the siblings formed the Carpenters, blending soft rock, lush harmonies, and heartfelt lyrics. They signed with A&M Records in 1969, and everything began to change. Their breakthrough came with the song "They Long to Be Close to You," a gentle, dreamy ballad that seemed to float on air. It was an instant hit, launching them into stardom. But even as the world began falling in love with Karen's voice, she remained grounded, or perhaps guarded. Behind every performance was a young woman still unsure of her place. The stage was vast, the cameras unforgiving. The praise came quickly, but so did the criticism, comments about her appearance, her weight, her looks. She heard them all. and slowly they started to shape how she saw herself. This was the beginning of a career that would span chart-topping albums, sold-out tours, and 3 Grammy wins. But it was also the beginning of a quiet unraveling, one that no one around her truly recognized. Because even in those early days, Karen Carpenter was already learning to disappear. By the early 1970s, Karen Carpenter's voice had become a fixture on radios across America. The Carpenters weren't just popular, they were everywhere. Their harmonies, their soft edges, their warmth. It was a comforting contrast to the turbulence of the era. While the world wrestled with war and unrest, the Carpenters offered something gentle, something safe, something pure. Songs like We've Only Just Begun, Superstar, and Rainy Days and Mondays didn't scream for attention. They settled in quietly, like familiar conversations you didn't know you needed. Karen's voice wrapped around the words like silk, giving heartbreak a velvet softness. She could take the simplest lyric and make it feel like a secret confession. Success came fast and wide, sold-out tours, platinum records, television specials, magazine covers. The Carpenters won 3 Grammys and became one of the best-selling acts of the decade, with over 90 million records eventually sold. Yet for Karen, fame was never a comfort. She didn't crave the spotlight. In fact, it often made her shrink further into herself. Still, she showed up. Always professional, always gracious. On stage, she smiled. She played the drums. She sang like no one else could. But behind that controlled exterior, the pressure began to take its toll. The image of the Carpenters was clean, wholesome, almost too perfect. And Karen, now constantly in front of cameras, began to feel the burden of maintaining that image. Critics began to make comments, not about her voice, but about her appearance. Words like chubby and plump appeared in headlines. At 5'4", she barely weighed 120 pounds, but in an industry obsessed with thinness, it was enough to make her self-conscious. Deeply so. It was during this time that she began dieting, quietly, methodically. It started with calorie counting, then meal skipping, then control became obsession, and obsession became danger. But no one saw it, not clearly, because all they saw was the music. Richard, too, was grappling with his own demons, eventually entering rehab for a prescription drug dependency. Karen was left to carry the public image alone, even as her private world grew smaller, more fragile. She was at the height of her fame, with the world at her feet. But fame, as it often does, didn't fill the silence inside. Instead, it made it louder. And so, even as her voice soared, Karen Carpenter was quietly fading beneath the applause. To the outside world, Karen Carpenter lived a dream: fame, success, adoration. But behind closed doors, her personal life was marked not by abundance, but by absence. She was surrounded by people, yet often profoundly alone. Her relationship with her family, particularly with her mother Agnes, was complex. Agnes was a strong-willed woman, deeply invested in her children's success, but often in ways that felt conditional. Richard was the prodigy, the one she celebrated most. Karen, despite her remarkable talent, often felt she had to earn love through perfection. Praise didn't come easily, affection even less so. It created a quiet hunger in Karen, not for food, but for validation, for worth. She remained close to her family physically, living just minutes from her parents' home, even during her stardom. But emotionally, there were barriers she couldn't cross. The unspoken expectations, the quiet comparisons, the subtle dismissals, they lingered. Karen internalized it all, becoming her own harshest critic. Love, in the romantic sense, eluded her too. She longed for connection, for partnership, for someone to see her not as a pop icon, but as a woman. Gentle, quirky, yearning. There were relationships, fleeting and hopeful, but fame complicated everything. Trust was hard to come by, sincerity even harder. In 1980, she married real estate developer Thomas Burris. For a moment it seemed like a new chapter was beginning. But the marriage quickly unraveled. Thomas was reportedly controlling and dishonest, and the union left Karen feeling even more isolated than before. She had hoped marriage would offer safety, love, maybe even motherhood. Instead, it brought disappointment and deeper emotional wounds. Through all of it, she turned to her work. Music became both her shield and her sanctuary. But even music couldn't silence the deeper ache, the need to be loved not for her voice, not for her fame, but simply for being Karen. Her brother Richard, though a creative partner and confidant, also struggled with his own demons. His battle with addiction led to a temporary breakup of their act, leaving Karen to navigate both career and crisis on her own. She gave so much, on stage, in recordings, in interviews. But when she returned home, when the lights dimmed and the makeup came off, she often found herself staring into silence. And in that silence, the emptiness grew. It didn't happen all at once. Like most tragedies born from pain, Karen's descent was gradual, quiet, even invisible to those closest to her. But behind the soft melodies and polished performances, her body was beginning to give out, and her heart, both figuratively and literally, was breaking. The pressure to maintain a certain image had become unbearable. Comments about her weight lingered like poison. She began to diet obsessively, charting every calorie, weighing herself multiple times a day. But this was no longer just about appearance. It was about control. In a world where everything felt overwhelming, family, fame, relationships, controlling her body felt like the only power she had left. By the mid-1970s, the effects were undeniable. Karen's frame grew alarmingly thin, her clothes hung loosely, her eyes sunken. Yet no one could bring themselves to name it. At the time, anorexia nervosa was barely understood, even within the medical community. It didn't have a language yet, just silence and fear. To accelerate weight loss, Karen began abusing ipecac syrup, a dangerous over-the-counter emetic used to induce vomiting. The repeated use caused irreversible damage to her heart muscles, slowly eroding the very organ that powered her music. By 1975, during a European tour, she collapsed from exhaustion. Doctors warned her, family grew concerned, but the illness was deeply rooted, psychological, emotional, physical. She began sleeping up to 16 hours a day. Food became the enemy. Mirrors became a battlefield. Her weight dipped below 90 pounds. Photographs from that era are painful to look at. Karen, smiling softly, dressed immaculately, yet disappearing before our eyes. In 1982, recognizing the severity of her condition, she finally sought treatment at a New York clinic specializing in eating disorders. For the first time, she acknowledged the illness. She wanted to get better, and for a brief moment, it seemed she was. She gained weight. She moved back to California. She even began working on new music. Friends said her eyes were brighter, her laughter more frequent. But the years of abuse had already taken a toll that couldn't be reversed. Her heart, damaged from years of malnutrition and chemical harm, was simply too weak. Karen Carpenter's breakdown wasn't one of scandals or outbursts. It was internal, hidden, a slow unraveling beneath the surface while the world kept dancing to her songs. And by the time the applause faded, the damage had already been done. The morning of February 4th, 1983 began like any other, quiet, still, unremarkable. Karen Carpenter had returned home to Downey after a brief stay in New York, feeling hopeful, if fragile. She had been gaining weight under medical supervision, working on a solo album, and speaking of new beginnings. To friends, she seemed brighter. To family, she looked stronger. But no one could see the battle still raging inside her body. That morning, her mother, Agnes, found Karen collapsed in her bedroom closet. She wasn't breathing. The ambulance arrived quickly, and she was rushed to Downey Community Hospital. But at 9:51 a.m., just a day after having dinner with her parents, Karen Carpenter was pronounced dead. She was 32 years old. The cause of death: heart failure brought on by years of self-starvation, exacerbated by the toxic effects of ipecac syrup. The news sent shockwaves through the music industry. Fans were stunned. How could someone so full of light, of promise, of voice, be gone so suddenly, so silently? The outpouring of grief was immediate, but beneath the sadness was also confusion. Many had never even heard the term anorexia nervosa. Karen's death became one of the first major public tragedies linked to the disorder. Her funeral was held 4 days later at Downey United Methodist Church. More than 1,000 mourners gathered, friends, celebrities, fans. Olivia Newton-John wept. Dionne Warwick offered condolences. The loss was felt not just as a musical void, but as a personal heartbreak. But perhaps the most haunting part of Karen's story is how many didn't see it coming, how many mistook her thinness for discipline, how long the silence lasted. In the 1989 TV biopic The Karen Carpenter Story, there's a scene where Karen looks at herself in the mirror, her body fragile, her eyes tired. That image, though dramatized, mirrored the truth too well. She had given the world her gift, her warmth, her sound, but had received little safety in return. She once said, "The image we present is not always the reality we live." And in the end, it wasn't the fame, the music, or the critics that claimed her. It was the quiet suffering behind a perfect smile. A loneliness no chart position could cure. A voice that gave so much, yet was never allowed to ask for help out loud. Long after the world stopped spinning her records daily, Karen Carpenter's voice continues to float, soft, steady, eternal. It lives in the quiet moments between radio frequencies, in Sunday mornings filled with nostalgia, in the tears of those who once danced to "Close to You" and whispered along to "Superstar." She may have left too soon, but she never truly disappeared. The decades following her death brought renewed interest in her life, not just as a pop icon, but as a deeply complex woman. Documentaries like Close to You, remembering the Carpenters and Karen Carpenter, starving for perfection, reframed her story. They didn't shy away from the pain, but instead honored the bravery it took to carry so much while asking for so little. Her influence stretched far beyond the realm of soft pop. Artists like Madonna, Sheryl Crow, and K.D. Lang cited her as an inspiration, not only for her technical control, but for the sheer emotion in her phrasing. Paul McCartney once called her the best female voice in the world. Coming from a Beatle, that wasn't flattery, it was fact. Even today, younger generations discovering the Carpenters for the first time are struck by the sincerity in her delivery. There's no artifice, no showmanship, just a woman singing truthfully, vulnerably, with every breath. And yet perhaps her greatest legacy lies not in music, but in awareness. Her tragic passing became a turning point in public understanding of eating disorders. Suddenly the term anorexia nervosa was no longer clinical jargon. It was something real, something devastating, something urgent. Karen's story gave a face, a voice, a heartbreak to a silent epidemic. Medical communities took note. Families began to speak. Campaigns to educate young people, especially women, on the dangers of self-starvation grew in momentum. Her death had cracked something open, a long overdue conversation about body image, perfectionism, and the invisible battles too many fight alone. Still, there remains a lingering sense of what could have been. More albums, a healthier life, a longer journey. But Karen Carpenter's voice, low, intimate, unhurried, carries on. Not as an echo of the past, but as a reminder. That beauty doesn't require suffering. That gentleness is not weakness, that even the softest voices can leave the loudest echoes. Karen Carpenter's story is not just one of talent lost, it's a mirror, a soft-spoken reflection of how fame, family, and quiet pain can intersect in ways the world often overlooks. Behind her silky contralto was a heart asking to be seen, not as a star, but as a woman trying to find peace in a world that only applauded her perfection. And maybe that's why her music still touches us so deeply. Because beneath every line she sang was a tremble, a truth, a longing that felt intimately human. Her voice was never just a performance. It was a confession. Today, as her records spin again on vintage turntables or stream through modern earbuds, Karen reaches across generations, not through spectacle, not through scandal, but through something rarer, genuine emotion. She reminds us that there is grace in vulnerability and that softness can be a form of strength. But her story also demands more than sentiment. It asks us to look around and ask, how many Karens are still with us, unheard? How many young people, especially women, are still waging silent wars against their own reflections? How many are shrinking themselves to fit into a mold they never asked for? Eating disorders, perfectionism, emotional neglect. These are not stories of the past. They are present, they are real, and they need to be met not with silence, but with compassion, education, and change. Karen never lived to see a world that understood what she was going through. But perhaps in telling her story, we can build that world for someone else. Perhaps what made people love Karen Carpenter wasn't just her voice, but the fragility she carried in every note, a whisper in a noisy world, reminding us that sometimes the ones who seem the softest carry the heaviest weight. Her story isn't just a tragedy, it's a quiet reminder that gentleness deserves protection, that silence deserves to be heard. If you know someone silently fighting their own battles, be the one who listens, ask, wait, and never underestimate the weight behind a quiet smile. Do you remember the first time you heard Close to You? Share your memories of Karen Carpenter in the comments below. And if her story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so that her voice, however soft, may never be forgotten.